Welcome to Plastic Model Mojo, a podcast dedicated to scale modeling, as well as the news and events around the hobby. Let's join Mike and Kentucky Dave as they strive to be informative, entertaining, and help you keep your modeling mojo alive.
Oh man, Dave. Episode 93, our third-ish episode for June. Man, brother.
The fates have really come after us in June, man.
I mean, I tell you, we aim to deliver, and man, have we had to struggle this month. And,
God.
We're recording this now, and we are just now getting things wrapped. I don't even remember what happened at the front of the month. I think
it was another power outage, wasn't it? That's the one where I lost power for one day and you lost power for like 5. Wasn't that it?
That was in March, wasn't it?
Was that in March? Okay, well, it's all compressed together, man.
So we've had a lot of suck this spring.
Yeah, that's right. Embrace the suck.
No, it was my son's getting done with school and having to deal with all that because we dropped the episode dropped really early in June.
That's right.
The first episode in June, and just a lot of life got in the way, and then I went on vacation.
My daughter had surgery.
Your daughter had surgery. So we got that one out. I actually edited that one at the condo in Florida.
Yep.
It was okay. We got some compliments on that episode, but to be honest, I was worried we were kind of phoning it in.
Yeah.
Kind of a softball topic, but some folks enjoyed it, so that's reassuring. Appreciate that.
Yep.
But this one, trying to close out strong, and June's just not having it, man.
Yeah. Giving people a peek behind the curtain. Normally we record on Sunday or Monday, and Sunday afternoon, evening, my neighborhood got hit by either an EF0 tornado or a microburst downdraft, and it flattened a couple of houses. It uprooted tons of trees. I got super lucky. I didn't lose a darn thing other than power for 3 days. So Mike and I are planning to do an interview with Dr. Miller on Sunday night. And next thing you know, I have no internet, no power for 3 whole days. And now we're playing catch up.
Well, because we know the grace of our listeners, Dave, we're going to give them a truncated episode.
Yep.
We had a nice conversation with Dr. Miller. But before we get into that, what else is up in your model sphere other than dealing with your inclement weather?
I'm still struggling to get to the bench as much as I want.
Kind of hard in the dark.
Yeah, I was going to say, I just lost 3 days. Because, kind of hard to model by candlelight or airbrush without electricity. But, so I'm rushing to get this F8 done for the Nationals, and I lost 3 days I could ill afford to lose. So I am really behind the 8 ball and, playing catch up. But you know what? Again, thankful that I've got, compared to many of my neighbors, I've got nothing to complain about. I am fired up for the Nationals. It was fun talking about how you prep for the Nationals. Lots of conversations going on in the back channels about getting ready for the Nationals, trying to arrange the rental car, you and Evan and I all driving down together. And, I'm really looking forward to this. So how about you?
Well, and all your ramblings there, I thought of another thing that's been going on in June has certainly not helped anything.
Which is?
That ungrateful adoptee dog of yours keeps chewing up your Cat 5 cables, your Cat 6 cables.
Yes. That's right. I have had to replace 2 Cat 6 cables in the last couple of months because my wife adopted a puppy, and the puppy is still teething. And I have made the mistake on a couple of occasions of leaving the Cat 6 cable stretched out across the family room overnight, and the dog gets bored and starts chewing on the cable. Now, by the way, my wife did not like your suggestion, although we did catch the dog chewing on a lamp cord cable tonight, so she may learn that lesson the hard way.
I had a dog when we were refinishing the basement at the old place, was licking the drywall dust out of a hot but unreceptacled receptacle box.
Yeah.
Yeah, didn't do that again.
That's right. I suspect the first time Winnie chews through one of these lamp cords, she'll probably never do it again. She'll also get a permanent perm.
Fat cat had 9 lives, Clark. She sure spent them all.
Exactly what we were talking about. My wife and I when we caught Winnie doing that, we immediately flashed back to National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation.
Well, we can talk about that in December. My model sphere, Dave, has been just trying to get all this stuff out the door, given all the stuff that's been going on. But I really appreciate the listeners being patient with us. And, it's self-imposed guilt, I guess, but we mentioned that last time. We just we'll keep on trucking, and hopefully July things will plane out and
yes,
be a little more normal.
And then we hit the Nationals, and man, we are pigs in slop when it comes to the Nationals time. So that's going to cure a lot of the quote unquote suffering that we've been going through in June.
Well, enough lamenting about our personal misfortunes.
Yes.
So, folks, here's what's happening for episode 93. We're going to jump right into our interview with Dr. Miller, Dr. Strangebrush, and it's a segment titled Stump the Airbrush Chump. And over the last month or so, via Plastic Model Mojo or John Miller's Model Paint Solutions site, we've been soliciting questions from the listenership and folks he's been dealing with through his website, and come up with a number of questions, and Dr. Miller's going to tackle those, and Dave and I will chime in where we've got some input or further inquiry, and hopefully folks can learn something. After that, hopefully Dave and I will get the normal segments for this episode recorded, and we'll drop that either as a bonus or something else, possibly just append this episode with the new audio. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but you're going to get it all eventually. We'll figure it out. So, Dave, let's get into Stump the Airbrush Chump.
You got it.
Dr. Strangebrush, welcome back to Plastic Model Mojo. How you been?
Yowza, yowza, yowza. Guys, how are you?
All things considered, we're upright and still got air going past our teeth, so I think we're doing pretty good.
Well, I'm alive and I still have a house. So that's, considering that some of my neighbors are not so lucky, man, I'm going to chalk it up as a win.
Yeah. I've been following that on Facebook. Wow.
Yeah. We got hit.
Yeah, you did.
Plastered.
So, you're talking to a guy who grew up in Florida. So I went through a fair number of those, and I was in Charleston, actually in graduate school, when Hurricane Hugo came right through the center. Yes, Hurricane World Tour. I was there.
And you have the T-shirt, don't you?
No, it got blown away.
It's right next to my Reno '92 T-shirt, which are both are just so threadbare now. I can't wear either one of them anymore. So yeah, I'm there.
John, we got something special tonight that you concocted. Stump the Airbrush Chump, and what we've done and you've done is solicit some questions from our listener base and your website followers, and distilled those into a set of hopefully cohesive questions. And
questions, yes. Cohesive, we'll see. And
Allegedly, there may be a prize at the end of this for somebody.
Yes, there is. Actually, we have 14 folks that were willing to email questions in. And I did this really cool. I was sitting at my desk and my wife was walking through the room, and I looked at my wife and I said, 1 through 14, pick out a number. And she said, number 9. And I said, okay. So Lee Fogel, who was the ninth guy to submit a question, he's going to get the Mix-a-Lot kit, and we're going to get that out to him in the next week or two. So Lee, if you're listening to this, please send me an email and give me your shipping address, and be looking for that.
All right.
So,
All right.
Yeah.
So
Congrats for Lee.
he put the prize up front.
Well, yeah.
That's right.
Well, yeah. But nonetheless, we've heard from a bunch of guys that we both know from the Facebook and the Model Mojo and Model Dojo Facebook pages, and emails I get pretty regularly. So a lot of these folks are folks I've known for a year or 2 or 3 or more, and a couple of them are brand new that came to us with sincere airbrushing issues. So I think it's a good mix of questions that goes from kind of newbie / beginner all the way through expert.
Let's not waste any time. Who's number 1 and what's the question?
Number 1 is Jason Campbell, and it's a pretty simple one. He's asking about what I would suggest for cleaning future floor wax out of his airbrush. And for that, I've shot future for years and years and years. For a long time, that was like my go-to gloss preparatory to decals.
Sure.
So and I still sometimes use it, if the situation calls for it. So
Yeah.
I like to clean that out with just 70% isopropyl alcohol. You can get at your pharmacy. That cuts it real well. And prior to actually cleaning it out of your airbrush, when I shot future, for years I shot it neat. For the non-Scotch drinkers out there, that's straight right out of the bottle, right? And what I found with a little, experimentation is that if you cut future or the new stuff now, which is like quick shine, or there's another one out there, guys.
Yeah.
There is, and it's available from Walmart. I think it's quick shine, but anyway, I know I'm gonna pay for that one, but nonetheless, if you cut the current version of future with about 20 to 25% Vallejo or Mission acrylic thinners, that breaks the surface tension of the future and lets it go on much, much easier. And you'll find a much easier time when you want to shoot the wet coat, and it'll level a bit more and give you a much, much smoother, finer finish. So anyway, let's call it 20-25% Vallejo or Mission thinner, and then just clean it with 70% isopropyl alcohol right from your pharmacy.
See, now that's a little bit different. I'm like you. I've shot future probably most of my life. I've only lately started to get away from it a little bit, but I still use it all the time. And I clean it using ammonia.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Just running ammonia through the airbrush. Now that stings, I will admit.
Not only that, you're treading into an area there that gets you into the you're going to get major league response from the Facebook trolls on this one, because you're putting them. Hey, I'm just calling it, man. So you're putting ammonia through your airbrush. I can hear it right now. People are having cardiacs all over the modeling world right now.
Oh no, it'll attack your brass. Oh no. Oh no.
Yep.
And no, it doesn't.
Well, if I could, and again, let's hope that the Mojo podcast is a place for nuance, as opposed to some of these other places that we've been deriding recently. But one of the things you have to think about is, are you using a brush that has a really nice, thick nickel or chrome plating, or are you using a brush that has a very thin nickel or chrome plating? So if you have spent a fair amount of money and you've gone to an Iwata or a harder Steenbeck, you can pretty much count on the plating being sufficiently thick so as to withstand, ammonia. Does that mean
Right.
for 10 years? No. If you take either one of those brushes and you do pure or, a percent of ammonia as a cleaner, when you're brushing every time, sooner or later with time, you're going to start seeing the brass show through the plating. But that's going to happen way, way longer down the road, if you will, than if you're shooting a brush that, to be blunt, does not have the same, quality plating.
Quality. Yeah. Well, and not only that, but the amount of time, first of all, the speed at which I model and the number of times, therefore, I use future in a year, and therefore the number of times I clean it. I'm pretty sure I will be skeletonized well before it does any damage to any airbrush I happen to be using.
So once again, I'm just going to put the neck out there. I just can't wait to hear this. I work on airbrushes all the time. I repair them, everything from Badgers to Awatas to Steenbecks, and I get to see the results of guys using ammonia or nothing but Windex or never touching Windex. And just to be blunt, if you do end up losing a little bit of that nickel plating in your paint cup, it is not the end of the world.
Yep.
I always thought most of the loss of nickel plating in the paint cup of my Badger was just from sticking my finger in there with a rag around it and wiping it out.
That's right. Absolutely.
I've said this before, and I can actually back it up. I started airbrushing in '73, and I still have the first Badger that I was given by my father in '73. And yes, I've used a lot of ammonia through it, and yes, most of the plating has gone in the paint cup, and yes, it still works perfectly fine. So anyway, I mean, there's some guys who are like, oh my God, if they lose plating in the paint cup, this is like a coronary. No, I mean, some guys, I appreciate that, especially if you spend a lot of money on your brush, you don't want to see that. But nonetheless, if it does happen with, years and years and years of service, it's not the end of the world.
Right. Exactly.
It's like a well-worn saddle. I mean,
that's right.
It's a patina. Hey, it's earned it, man.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
All right.
What's next?
Okay, so now after talking about that, let's move on to Frank Blanton. And Frank has asked for an update on Mission Paints. And yeah, I got to thinking about this, and I want to try to divide my answer into like a two-parter here. I want to deliver it as a public service announcement.
In other words, nuance again.
Yes, we're into nuance, guys, as well as just an update. So the service announcement. When I hit, Facebook and the other social media, when I force myself to do it, and I read through some of the posts, so many of the problems that guys are experiencing with Mission and almost all the acrylic paints that we use in, the modeling world is because they're not degreasing properly prior to priming and painting. And I get this all the time from my site. And I get it particularly from guys who spent 20 years shooting lacquers, gunze, and that kind of stuff. And they move into acrylics, whether it's Life Color, Vallejo, or Mission. And, because, their wife is tired of the fumes and, yada, yada, yada. And they don't get anything to stick. And it's because for years they were using lacquer-based primers and paints that do a really good job of cutting through mold release and finger oil.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get that with an acrylic. And so if you're going to switch into acrylics, the reality of it is you're going to have to spend a bit more time degreasing both before you build the model and before you shoot primer in order to ensure that both your acrylic primer and your acrylic paints will stick to the point that you can tape and demask and not have paint, flicking off.
I don't know about you, but I am really oily as far as my skin goes. And
bless your heart. Bless your heart.
Yeah, well, it's probably a byproduct of being a lawyer. But in any event,
I thought you're the missing Lord of Flatbush.
There you go. But I mean, I'm telling you what, after I built, I degrease, and I wear gloves constantly from that point forward, never touching the model with my bare skin, just simply because I've had it again and again where the oil ruins a finish or mars a finish, and then you have to go back and go 3 steps back to try and fix the problem. I don't think a lot of people realize how much oil and skin deposits they end up leaving when they touch things.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And the guys, again, not to beat a dead horse, but the guys that have been using lacquers and enamels for the first part of their modeling experience there, they have taken advantage of that chemistry, and they have it. They don't have to worry about removing the mold release. They don't have to worry about the accumulated finger oil, because by the very chemistry of what they're using, lacquers or enamels, it's going to cut right through that. And then they move in the lacquers, and nothing sticks.
You mean acrylics?
Well, excuse me, acrylics. And nothing sticks, and stuff comes off with tape, yada yada yada. And most of the time, and again, I get a lot of these emails through the site, but most of the time you can track that back to, hey, take a minute and take the sprues. And I've written this in many articles on the site, Model Paint Solutions, the homepage there. If you take a 1-to-1 solution of denatured alcohol, right, for cleaning glass, not for fuel.
No, the fuel has an oily substance in it.
Yes, it does. And you don't want to go down that road. It's a world.
Go to your paint store.
Yes. Sherwin-Williams, actually.
Yes. I've got a gallon from Sherwin-Williams.
Exactly. I go and get a gallon at a time.
And it lasts forever.
And you can mix that 1-to-1 with Windex.
Tastes awful, though.
But the ammonia stuff, the old style Windex, mix that 1-to-1. And I get, those aluminum turkey pans, with the, deep enough to
right.
And large enough to accommodate the sprues. I put them in there. I fill them. I cover them, I should say, with the 1-to-1 of DA and Windex. I let them sit for 3 or 4 hours, sometimes overnight.
Yeah, because it's not going to attack the plastic.
Nope, it does not. All it's going to do is remove. And here's the deal. And here's the nuance. So if you're building Tamiya and Airfix, you probably don't have to worry that much about mold release. If you're doing something from the Czech Republic or old, MPM or Special Hobby or old Fujimi that's been sitting around for 20, 30 years before you build it.
Or any short run kit.
Or, a lot of short run kits. Exactly right. That's just a consequence of the breed, if you will. So for
who was it, Dave, that somebody shared with us we were discussing this offline, well, off the podcast, but was it Evan that showed us that picture of that kit? It looked like it had like drops of motor oil all over it.
Yes, I think it was Evan. And it was an old kit that had sit in the box, and obviously over time the mold release agent revealed itself. Because normally it's clear and you don't see it.
I don't think it was an old kit.
Oh, wasn't it? I thought it was one older kit.
I thought it was one of those. I want to think it was that new Panzer II from.
Maybe it was.
Who makes that kit? IBG.
Yeah.
Somebody
but again,
like
that makes Dr. Miller's point. IBG, Eastern Europe, Poland, where they're a little more reliant on that type of stuff.
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
John, while we're on this one, do you run into people? Well, let me ask it a different way, because we've talked about it a couple of times when you've been on before. But either the Mission Models poly additive or some other polyurethane additive going into the mix before you airbrush this paint. With the Mission Models, especially if you're going to be doing any masking or heavy weathering, is really not optional, is it?
No, it's not. And that's actually something I wasn't going to discuss, but it's absolutely germane to what we're discussing right now. And so if I could, to back up just a little bit, after you degrease the model in the 1-to-1 and you build the model, before you go, to shooting your primer, you're going to want to remove the finger oil. You remove the mold release, right? But now you've handled it for 20, 30, 40, whatever hours. And now you've got to remove some of that finger oil or all of that finger oil from the plastic prior to shooting your primer and your paint, especially if you're shooting acrylics. So for that, I go straight to clean DA, neat, right from the can, no Windex.
What is clean DA?
Just denatured alcohol.
Clean denatured alcohol. Yep. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not in on the cool lingo.
Well, I'll send you a memo.
Oh, right. Okay.
So I'll go neat with DA and not to plug MPS products, but one of the things I've used for 20 plus years are chem wipes, and they're lint-free tissues that are designed for use with microscope objectives, where you can't have any lint or dust whatsoever. And in addition to that, when used dry, chem wipes actually remove static electricity. That's what they're designed to do. One more reason you want to use them on a microscope objective, so you don't want to confer static charge, which ruins the image. So right. I will take a chem wipe and I will saturate it with straight denatured alcohol. I'll wipe the model down, and then I'll wipe it dry with a chem wipe, and then I'll take another dry chem wipe and I'll give it a quick buffing just to remove the static electricity that has accumulated in the plastic. If you think just 1 second, if it was a Tamiya kit and it went together with 3 hours of work, good for you. If it's a MPM or special hobby or something like that, and you've spent 20, 30, 40 plus hours, grinding and buffing and blending, you have a lot of static electricity built up in that plastic. And you can dissipate that with a rub down with a dry chem wipe. So kind of get a little tangentized there, but the most important thing is to get the finger oil off the plastic if your intention is to use an acrylic-based primer or down the road an acrylic-based paint.
There's a lot there.
There is a lot there. Sorry.
That's what we want. We want meat, man.
So the other thing is, while we're here, I'm going to go ahead and touch on it. For those folks who started using Mission paints when they first came out, you may remember that some of those paints were about as thick as slightly liquefied toothpaste. And it made blending those paints, mixing those paints for airbrushing a bit of a challenge because they were so thick. And one of the things that has changed is with the more recent Mission paints, I'd say in the last year or so, they are, for the most part, across the board thinner. They're not as, toothpastey as they were when they first came out. And in the long run, that's going to give you, an easier time when it comes to mixing and blending the paint for shooting in your airbrush. One thing you're going to have to be mindful of, though, and not to get too technical, but if you're dealing with the old Mission paints, you can pick the bottle up, and it will take, if the bottle has been sitting on the shelf for, a couple of weeks, it will take 3 or 4 cycles of mixing before the mixing ball dislodges itself from the bottom of the bottle and you start hearing it thunk. Mm-hmm. The new stuff, you can pick the bottle up and you can hear that ball bouncing around within 2 or 3 shakes.
More like a more traditional acrylic.
Yes, exactly right. It's way more like a Vallejo or a Life Color, it's still thicker than a Vallejo or a Life Color, but is closer to them now, the new version, than it was when it first came out. Now, the challenge then is that if you go back and read some of the very early articles that I wrote on using Mission paints, I was saying, use dilutions of 10, 20%. That's with a paint that, has the viscosity of liquefied toothpaste.
Right.
So the new stuff now, which is not much thinner, but it is thinner, now you're not going to be using that really at 10 or 15%. Now you're using that more at 20, 30, 40%, which, by the way, is much more in line with the same percent volumes that you use for other acrylic paints like Vallejo and Life Color and, you name it, the old Model Master. So anyway, there's something there that, again, Frank, who's a big Mission Models paints user, he and I exchanged a couple of emails on this, and he's run into this, as a lot of Mission guys have, who started, brand new with the paint, and they followed along, and now they have a rack of paint that has 2 different viscosities. No worries. No worries. Little common sense when you go to, dilute them for airbrushing. Still, for fine line, for the thick stuff, for the new stuff, 10 or 15, maybe 20% paint. For the newer, thinner stuff, you're going to be going 30, 40, maybe 50% paint. Again, much more in line with the Vallejo stuff. So
Gotcha.
that's about all we have for the update on mission paints.
All right.
Yeah.
Next.
Yeah, next. How to keep dust out of your paint. Man.
Oh,
Huh? How about that for a universal?
oh yeah.
This is from Andrew Armstrong.
Static electricity is one of those things to
It's
consider.
one of those things to consider, especially if you also consider that for most of us, you're sitting in front of a paint booth and it is sucking air into it, right? Which means any dust that's in the room is going to be sucked into your paint booth.
Yep.
so it's amazing anything actually works sometimes.
Yep.
So it's a good question. I get this a lot. How do you keep the dust down in your finish, especially if you're shooting in, let's say, auto models, car models, and you're shooting gloss coat? How do you ensure that? I don't want to take too much time with this, but it is kind of an interesting kind of a 30-second side story. As many of you guys know, I was a PhD in chemistry. I was at the University of Washington. I was doing biomedical research and transplant surgery, and I took a year off. And my wife and I relocated to Wisconsin, and I did nothing except turn wrenches on 1-to-1 scale airplanes and had the opportunity to fly my Chump cross country with my wife in the back seat there and back through the mountains. It was an awesome experience. And one of the things I did while in Wisconsin was I worked with a paint shop that was doing 1-to-1 scale airplanes. And the first time I went into this shop to shoot a real airplane, the guy that was running the shop had a water hose. And he was shooting the walls of the hangar and the floor down so that they were sopping wet. And I'm looking at that going, my God, what a mess. And he looked at me and said, basically, stop back and think about it. You've got all these puddles of water that are going to attract and trap dust. And so after we wet the entire hangar down, we closed it down, we shot paint on this airplane, and it came out beautiful. I mean, hardly any dust in the finish at all. And that's a big surface area. So I took that experience home with me when I went, back to my little, paint booth. And when I'm shooting a gloss coat or something where I really need the dust to be at an absolute minimum, I will take a moment and take a spray bottle, and I will spray the entire inner surface of my paint booth down with water to the point where it's, little droplets of water all over the place. And those are nothing but little dust traps that are going to serve to filter, if you will, dust coming into the air booth. And the other thing that I will do is, I shouldn't say it, I'm going to put it on the line again. When it comes to that point where you're shooting the gloss coat and you're ready to shoot the wet, the wet fill coat of your gloss coat, I will sometimes reach out and just momentarily, dare I say it, shut my vent down. Okay, I can hear the emails already.
But you hold your breath.
I do. I hold my. I have a mask.
You're wearing one of those big HEPA masks. You're
exactly, and a tank on my back with the big rubber thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
You're in a full hazmat suit.
Exactly. You got it. Andromeda strain.
There you go.
Stuff. Right. So I will shut the booth down for a moment while I shoot my wet coat and let that sit for a minute before I will then move my masterpiece into oftentimes like a Tupperware container, a large Tupperware container.
One of those cake topper things is what I use.
Yeah, go to Fred Meyer and get yourself a big thing of, banana nut bread or whatever in one of those big plastic containers.
Yep.
Those things are great. You clean them out and, you set a couple of chem wipes in the bottom there, set your model in there, close it, and set it aside on the side of your bench for 2 or 3 days.
Yep.
So that's how I do it. So I have not come up with a better way of decreasing dust in your finish, other than, again, simply wetting down the inside of your paint booth so that it's sopping wet. That is an easy and very quick way to decrease, I'd say, at least 60-70% of the dust that you're going to get in your finish.
That's a great tip. I'd never thought about that.
I never thought of it either until I stood there and watched.
Every time we have you on, I learn something.
Well, Dave, you know what the saying is: if you do something long enough,
that's right.
Whether you want to or not.
That's what my wife keeps saying.
Yep. Okay, so next one here, Scott. I'm going to get this wrong. Scott Skachowiak
or Stakowiak.
Yeah, Stakowiak. Does that name ring a bell?
There it goes.
Yes, it does. I don't know if that's right. That's the way I've always pronounced it. I think he corrected me once, or at least gave me a full pronunciation. Anyway, that's who he is to us.
So he asks about tanked compressors, and in particular, his question was, if you have, a conventional, beater compressor with no tank, and you have a water trap, on that rig as well as an air regulator, is that going to dampen the pulsation sufficiently that you don't need a tank? I'm going to take the old school answer with this and say no. In my experience, again, nuanced answer. If you are shooting at 12 to 15 to 18 psi and you're doing general work or clear coats and primers, then those pulsations probably aren't that big of a deal for you, right? However, if you're somebody who's decided to do some fine line work and you want to dial this down, dial your PSI down to 10 PSI, 10 or 12 PSI coming out of the compressor. And then for me, if I'm doing something what I call super fine line, and just as an aside, if you want to see an example of this, if you go to my site, Model Paint Solutions, you'll see that I did a 1/144th scale I-16 Rada in a Spanish Civil War scheme that was modeled, okay? And which means the models were like, the size of your cuticles, okay? And for some super fine line work like that, you're going to have to dilute your paint accordingly and a whole bunch of these other things. But one of the things you're going to have to do is take your pressure from 10 or 12 psi, and with an inline valve or similar, take that down to somewhere between 6 to 8, guesstimating, psi. And once you get down to those lower pressures for fine line work, the pulsations will be an issue. And that's where they really manifest, is on the lower end. So nuanced answer time, if you're shooting at 12, 15 PSI or greater and you're not doing fine line work, you can probably get away with one of those straight, direct drive compressors and, do perfectly fine, work that you're happy with. If you want to do fine line, if you want to be able to do some nuance with the airbrush, you're probably going to have to put the money into a tanked compressor in order to do away with the pulsations. So that's my nuanced answer on that. Bottom line, tanked compressor. I'm old school. There are a lot of tanked compressors out there right now that you can get for less than $100. And I'm going to recommend one later on here as a response to another question. So if you want to up your game and you have a direct drive compressor, you can get for less than $90 or so, you can get one off of Amazon with a small tank that works beautifully.
Moving on, John.
Moving on. Yeah. Hopefully we're not going too fast.
No, we're doing beautiful.
Cool. Kevin Patrick, he asks about, he recalls a previous conversation we had about straining clear coats. He also asked whether it's a good idea to strain paints. In short, yes. Especially and I'm going to roll this into another question. I'm bringing it 2 for 1 here. Another question by Tom Dunford, a local IPMS guy here in Seattle, a friend of mine. He also asks about filtering old paints that you've resurrected. That have been on your shelf for a long time. You've added some thinner to them. You've moved that sludge off the bottom of the bottle and got it into the solution. Should you filter that? In short, Yes.
Heck yes.
Yes, heck yes. And it's bad enough if you have a new bottle of paint that has the crusties around the neck of the bottle there, which
Yeah.
occasionally drop into the paint when you open the bottle. That's going to lead to a whole bunch of texture when you try to airbrush that. Even worse if you have a paint that's old and has partially dried in the bottom of the bottle. So again, cheap product plug. I first used them a couple of years ago. The AK paint filters. They work really, really well. They're good for lacquers, enamels, acrylics. And anytime I'm shooting a resurrected paint, I will put that through a filter. I'm always amazed at the amount of gunk that the filter takes out of that paint. If I'm shooting, I don't really filter my gloss coats. I have to be honest. I probably should, but I've gotten away with not filtering them. What I have started filtering are my flats, mattes, and satins.
I got one of those AK cups from you, and I've been using it both on gloss and satins and flats. And I've got to admit, I'm amazed at what gets trapped in that cup that you had no clue was in the clear coat.
Exactly.
It's really surprising.
Yep, it's a little scary, isn't it?
Well, it's the thing that that if that was in the cup and got sucked into the airbrush, you'd end up all of a sudden spraying along and it would stop spraying and you couldn't figure out why, and then it would suddenly come out as a burst of material.
You got it. Or after the model is glossed and you come back the next day, you look at the finish, there's these clumps and goobers, that they made it through the nozzle. You had the lever pulled far enough back so that the nozzle was big enough that they got through.
Yeah.
And now they're in your finish. So,
I am amazed, I will tell you, from having gotten those cups from you and using them to filter the clears, how much stuff gets filtered out.
Yes.
That I didn't know.
I was too.
That I did not know was there.
I was too. And, not to beat this too much, but a couple of podcasts back, I mentioned taking the old Tester's dull coat that we all grew up with as kids, right?
Yeah.
And I took some of that Tester's dull coat and I brought it up in the new AK nitrocellulose lacquer thinner. And before I shot it, I filtered it. And, I got a small mouse. This hairy, clumpy thing, right, in the bottom of the filter. But when I shot that old style Tester's dull coat after being filtered, it gave a beautiful finish that had no texture or anything to it. So I never thought I would say go back to Tester's dull coat, but if you really want to kill something, shine wise. You bring that stuff up in, again, nitrocellulose thinner, which is a semi-leveling thinner. Bring that up in thinner, filter it, most importantly, and it behaves entirely differently. Anyway, so in short, whether it's a clear coat or whether it's a paint, if you've resurrected it, you probably are going to want to filter it.
Well, what are we up to now? 5?
We are up to, man, we still got a ways to go here, guys. This is getting a little scary.
It's your idea, man.
Yeah, I know. Tell me about it. Okay, let's cut to a couple. I'm gonna do a couple of these as quickly as I can. This is from Peter Klee, which is a guy that is contributed to Reddit Scale Model, and he wants a cheap starting out unit for a budget. How about that? Okay. So I'm gonna blow everybody's mind.
We talking airbrush?
Airbrush and compressor.
Exactly. He wants a unit. So, as you guys know, I'm a harder Steenbeck guy. There's only one. Yeah. There's only 2 brushes on my site, and it's predominantly harder Steenbeck for a reason. But I have to admit that if you guys have not heard of the new Gallery airbrushes, which have come out, I'd say in the last 3 or 4 months. And for an astoundingly small amount of money, less than $50, you get a essentially 2-in-1 boxing which is a 0.35, and I think it's a 0.5 tip. So you get two different size tips, two different size paint cups, dual action gravity feed, and all for less than $50. So now,
see, I thought you were going toward the Evolution, which to me,
well, no, see, that's why I'm going to blow everybody's mind, because I don't sell the gallery. And so everybody's, well, he's gonna push the Evolution. No, I'm not. If you if you are new to airbrushing, if you're not sure you're going to want to stay with it as a sport, you can't go wrong with a $45 airbrush.
Yeah.
And I bought one. I have two actually now in my shop. I've given them both test drives. They handle perfectly fine. They're very good brushes. They really do handle quite nicely. Now, reality check. How is the plating on these brushes going to hold up with time, especially if you're using strong lacquer paints? Unknown. How available are the seal kits and O-ring kits and yada, yada, yada? You're going to need to maintain this brush long term. And trust me, they all break down sooner or later. How readily available will these seal kits be? Unknown. I'm just trying to be honest. Also, if you're interested in fine line work, I've taken the gallery airbrush with its finest tip down to the lowest pressure I can get, and it still does not outperform a 0.15 harder Steenbeck tip. So if you still want the super fine line performance, you're going to have to pay for a tip that's 0.15 millimeter. But that's not what we're talking about, right?
Well, let me step in, since you are much too shy to do it. Let me step in and say, Mike and I have talked an episode or two back about paying a little more for a quality tool. We were talking about tweezers that actually close and stuff like that. Cutters that cut. What's the MSRP on the Evolution? What's the price on the Evolution?
It's $154. I have it priced as low as I can price it and still get airbrushes from ours.
I am here to tell you that while yes, okay, that may well be a great purchase to pick up an airbrush, but that you've never airbrushed before and you're not sure whether you're going to want to. But then again, by the same token, I'm not convinced that spending a little more for an Evolution or its equivalent in somebody else's line, I'm not pimping here, but that you're going to get a much happier experience because the quality control is going to be so much nicer.
I don't disagree with that at all, and I appreciate you saying that. I really do. And that's my feeling. I think $150 for an introductory airbrush, especially one that you can grow into, quote unquote, right? A lot of these brushes you're not going to be able to grow into.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing about the brush you're talking about.
Right.
Once you've mastered the basics, I'm not sure you're going to grow with that airbrush anymore.
No, I agree with you with that. And let's remember, if you decide to ante up into an Evolution, which is going to be more money, you're going to be starting with a 0.2 tip, but you can get a 0.15 tip that fits that, which is the smallest production tip made. You can get a 0.4 tip, a 0.6 tip, all that fits the same airbrush. And that's the real utility, in my opinion, of the harder Steenbeck system over all the other hard airbrush systems out there. Is with one airbrush, you can have a full range of tip sizes. But the gentleman's question was not, if you just want to sample the sport and see if it's something you want to try,
right? Then
you really can't shoot down a $45 airbrush. Yep. And as far as compressors go, and this is another one, this is a big stumbling block for a lot of guys. You can get the cheap direct drive, no tank compressor for $40, $50, $60, where you find it secondhand or whatever.
And you get the entertainment of watching it move around the floor as you airbrush.
I remember as a kid, I used to actually, like a soccer ball, I'd bounce it back and forth between my feet while I was airbrushing.
Yeah.
Because it would wobble
It'll
and
dance
travel.
all over the floor.
Oh God, that was with the good days, right?
Yeah.
So, but nonetheless, if you go on the big A, which is Amazon, you will find a compressor made by Zuny, Zuny. There's a plug. And for about $85 to $90, this is a small compressor, tanked compressor unit. It's the cutest little thing. I bought one for my shop. I use it regularly. The thing works beautifully. It's quiet. I have recommended it to multiple customers, and all of them have come back with good experiences. I can't recall a time when for, let's call it $90 delivered, you could get a small tanked compressor with a air pressure gauge and a water trap.
Yeah, that's amazing, because back in the day, one of the little dancing direct drive compressors was $85, $90.
That's right. And now it's like I said. Did I say it's the cutest little thing?
Yes,
so
you did.
You got the tank on the bottom. You have a little motor on top. And again, I use mine, I'd say once every other week, and I've had it for the last 2 or 3 years, and it's worked perfectly fine. So, bottom line, if you want to pick up a Zuny, Zuny, a Zuny compressor, and you add the gallery airbrush for roughly $130, $140, you can be sitting at your bench and shooting some paint. Now, when you're ready to up your game, luckily, that little compressor will connect to whatever airbrush you want, including, as chance would have it, a Hardest Team Back Evolution.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go. But to get you in the game, just, get you on the court and playing, that's something you want to think about. And I just have to be honest and say this again, it's a brush that for $40, you can't beat it.
Right.
So, okay.
And
so
if it dies, you're out $40.
You're out $40. That's right. And you got a taste of what the sport is like and whether you want to do it, again or not. So,
right.
Okay. Next one, Lee Fogel. Nice guy. He asked a really good question about pigments settling in the paint cup while you're airbrushing. This happens very regularly, at least in my hands in particular, with metallics.
Right.
And whether it's the old Alclad you're shooting or the new AK Extreme, which is what I'm shooting these days, once you get those Hummers diluted up and you're shooting them in the airbrush, be mindful if you notice that your pattern begins to, disintegrate, if you will. And also notice if you start shooting a dry, powdery kind of coat, because what's happened, again, with the metallics in particular, those pigments have settled because they're so heavy. And so, now you're basically sucking mostly pigments with less thinner and binder through the bottom of the paint cup. So when I'm shooting metallics, I'll often take, again, shameless plug, I've got some very small, about 2-inch long micro pipettes on Model Paint Solutions that are ideal for this. Mm-hmm. And I'll have one of those very handy when I'm shooting a metallic. So every couple of moments, and I do mean moments, I can take that little micro pipette and stick the tip into the paint cup and suck the paint up and push it down again, keeping the tip of the pipette in the paint cup, and resuspend the metallics. That's, again, in particular, if you're shooting Alclad or AK Extreme metallics. You may find with other paints that with time, the pigments will settle in the paint cup, and it will change, both the pattern and the finish that you're getting. So whether it's metallics or not, if it's going to be a long, drawn-out paint job where you're going to have this in your paint cup for 45 minutes, an hour, longer, you're probably going to have at least something to stir the paint up with, physically, or, in my opinion, ideally, have a small pipette off to the side where you can suck the paint up and blow it back out and resuspend it in the paint cup. Really good question from Lee Fogel on that one.
Well, let me jump in here on this one. Outside of metallics, that's just a thing with metallics I've always recognized and dealt with it in a similar fashion to the way you're describing. But with more regular paint, typically when I'm having that happen in the paint cup, it is a twofold kind of thing. It is often, not always, but when I've experienced it, it's been a marginally compatible thinner, and It seems to exacerbate itself with higher dilutions. If that
Yes.
thinner you're using in that paint is not exactly the best thing to be using with that paint.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
for example, a hardware store mineral spirits with a hobby enamel.
Yes.
Maybe it'll work with some
Yes.
enamels fine. Maybe it won't.
Another good one, if I could jump in here, your Home Depot Lowe's lacquer thinner, which is really quite dry. And for some paints, you're going to get away with it. It's going to give you exactly what you want. For other, lacquer enamels that you have diluted in that, they're going to start precipitating. They're going to start dropping to the bottom of the paint cup. They're not going to stay in solution.
The difference between a Lowe's lacquer, which I have a can of and use from time to time, and Mr. Color leveling thinner, the differences are night and day as far as the compatibility across the paint spectrum.
Yes. A lot of guys don't appreciate how some of those lacquer thinners, Home Depot, Lowe's, they actually dry the paint out.
Yeah.
And this is a really great segue for the next question.
Great.
From and when that smooth, was that cool or what?
That was AM radio smooth.
So this is from Father Raphael Shelton.
Yep.
So don't screw it up.
Okay. That's right.
He is the deacon of his church, and Father Shelton writes in and says, "Do you have any tips for guys shooting lacquer paints?"
All day long.
This is a great segue for this.
Yeah.
So, if you are, let's take somebody who is shooting a Home Depot, Lowe's lacquer thinner, and they're shooting you name it, AK Real Colors or Gunze or Akan or whatever lacquer enamel you're shooting. Okay, you're shooting in this very dry, cheap, let's call it, lacquer thinner from the hardware store. One of the things you can do to make that stuff behave a little nicer is to add a little retarder to it.
Yeah.
Because that thinner is going to make the paint dry out way faster than you want it to, especially if you're shooting a gloss coat or you're doing fine line work. So again, shameless product plug time. On the site, I have it's Mr. Color, Mr. Retarder. I don't understand the whole Mr. thing. You guys get the, anyway, never mind. So
it's Japanese.
So I love the stuff. I've been using it for years. And, I add it to Mr. Color thinner, Mr. Color leveling thinner. If I'm shooting a gloss, the more you retard that, especially if it's a gloss, the shinier the finish you're going to get. But if you're shooting Home Depot lacquer thinner and you're doing mottling, on a Luftwaffe project, adding some of that Mr. Retarder to your lacquer thinner to, I'd say, maybe 10, 15% by volume, and add that to the thinner ahead of time. You set that up in its own little container. It's not going to go bad. And then once you get 10 or 15% retarder in that very dry lacquer thinner, you may find that your fine line goes a little easier. You don't get as many goobers. They don't build up as quickly. You don't get as dry and over powdery, overspray that you do, without having a retarder in the paint. So again, to answer Father Shelton's question, one step that you can take if you're shooting lacquers, not acrylics, is to throw some retarder in your mix. You will not regret it.
Would you do me a favor and explain to people why adding retarder makes your gloss finish glossier?
Sure. So one of the things, think about it, do you remember when we were a kid, those Powers of 10 videos? You remember that, where it would be like the Earth and then the orbit and then the planets? So think about a Power of 10 kind of approach here when you're looking at a gloss finish versus, let's say, a flat finish. So with a gloss finish, you want that, microscopically speaking, if you will, you want that gloss finish to dry as smooth and as fine as you can, because that's what's going to give you the reflection of the light, which gives you the gloss.
Right.
Conversely, if you are shooting a flat, if you looked at that microscopically, that's not going to be smooth and glossy when it's dry. It's going to be rough.
Right.
And it's going to dissipate light as opposed to reflecting it. Okay.
Mhm.
So that being the case, if you're shooting, so with a retarder, what you're doing is you're slowing the paint down so that once it hits the surface of the model, right, it moves, it levels on its own. It finds the smoothest finish that it can. That's what the retarder does. It slows it down. And with that in mind, if you're shooting, let's say, a flat or a satin or a matte, I find I actually leave the retarder out. And
Gotcha.
I shoot those somewhere between 15 to 20% by volume, but with no retarder, because there you don't want to retard the paint. You want that to hit the finish and dry slightly rough so as to, dissipate the light when it's dry. So does that make sense?
Yep. That's why I wanted to ask.
Cool. Okay. Shall we keep going?
Yes.
We shall.
All right. We're coming through them here.
Good.
Okay. So this is from Peter Kwong. And he asks, cleaning after red, yellow, and metallics. Yeah. I probably told this story before many years ago. I was doing a spit marked, I think it was like mark 22, 24, something like that. And I was down to shooting the gloss coat preparatory to decals. And I had just the tiniest little bit of residual metallic in my airbrush.
Oh.
And I added my gloss coat, and I think I ended up with the world's first pearled Mark 22. So, and I, obviously never forgot that experience. So
it looked like your Mark 22 had been to the stripper lounge and it got glitter all over it.
It was bad. Bad. Ended up in the round file. You know how it is. It happens. So he asks a good question here. What do you recommend for cleaning, especially if you're doing repetitive colors, one after the other, and you're using a strong color like a red, a yellow, or even worse, a metallic. So, and this actually also flows into a question from Tim, just the right height Nelson. Here.
Also known as Tim Too Tall Nelson.
I'm going to pay for that.
Yes, I know.
No, I'm going to pay for that.
Yes, I do.
Anyway, he also has a related question about speckles when he first starts shooting a paint through his airbrush after he has cleaned it and put it away. And so these two are actually related. So let's get back to Peter's question about cleaning after red, yellow, or metallics. So I'm going to run through this kind of quickly. We've talked many times about the 3 for 5. That's 3 soaks for 5 minutes each. I will clean the paint cup out with a Q-tip. I will add thinner. I will dislodge all of the particulates that have dried to the inside of the paint cup with a Q-tip. Once those are clear, I will add my cleaner or my thinner to the paint cup. I will work the action, blow it out a little bit with some air pressure. I used to recommend putting that into your airbrush holder and then waiting 5 minutes and then blowing that out, replenishing the thinner, working the lever vigorously, putting it back into your stand for another 5 minutes. Do that 3 times, 5 minutes each, 3 for 5. The new and improved, I guess, version of that is instead of placing the airbrush in your stand, if you are using a pencil style airbrush, not a Grex or a pistol grip, and you get yourself a shot glass with a deep, the heavy bottom, not the thin bottom, but the heavy bottom. So you've got some weight on
deep shot glass.
Deep shot glass. Get yourself one of those, and put yourself 2 or 3 or 4 millimeters of your thinner or your cleaner in the bottom of that shot glass. And once you put cleaner in the paint cup and you work the lever a couple of times, instead of putting it in your holder, put the tip of your airbrush submerged into that shot glass. And if you have the average airbrush that has a protector for your needle, you won't be ruining the needle. It'll just be resting on the protective nose piece. Let it sit in that shot glass submerged. Every once in a while, work the lever back and forth vigorously. You can actually see paint gushing out of the tip of the airbrush into the shot glass when you do that. Right? Let that sit for 5 minutes. Blow it out. replace with fresh thinner, back into your shot glass for a second 5 minutes. Do 3 5-minute soaks in your shot glass. And you might be surprised just how clean you can get that airbrush by doing your 3 for 5 soaks, again, in with the tip, the nozzle, and the tip of the needle submerged in the cleaner that you're using. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing is if I've shot red, one of the worst. Let's pick the worst case scenario here. For some reason, we've painted ourselves into a horrendous situation, a corner of having to shoot red and then white.
Yeah.
Okay. So for situation,
normally you want to do that the other way around, but let's say we've screwed up.
We screwed up, and do you feel lucky?
Punk.
So, exactly. So for a situation like that, I'm going to do, again, if I'm just using one airbrush, I'm going to do my 3 for 5 soaks. But one of the things that I also do is something that I call the lawn dart maneuver.
Okay. You have my attention.
And so I'm going to describe this as follows. You take your brush, and for the guys out there, when they hear this, they're going to think, "Oh my God, this guy has gone so far off the rails. Too many CA fumes for too many years." Do yourself a favor and do this little experiment. When you think you've cleaned your airbrush to the point of it being cleaned, disconnect the air hose, and then grab the brush firmly in your throwing hand. And then pretend that you're going to lawn dart the airbrush right into the floor between your 2 feet with a vigorous flicking motion, trying to flick, in your mind's eye, trying to flick any fluid within the airbrush from the tail of the brush to the nose of the brush. So do the lawn dart maneuver 2 or 3 times. Reconnect it to your air supply. You'll be surprised when you thought the brush was clean and there was nothing residual left in the brush. You do the lawn dart maneuver and you will get a little psht of thinner / cleaner that was still in the brush. That's the stuff that if you have the wrong mix of cleaner / thinner and the new paint that you're going to use next, that can cause a whole bunch of problems. And the worst example, let's take it, right off the bat. I've had this multiple times. Guys who are using one airbrush and they're shooting lacquers and they're shooting acrylics.
Oh.
Yeah, and they're going back and forth, and what they're finding is their acrylics are turning into cottage cheese.
Yep, because they're contaminated with just ever so little lacquer thinner. It takes a whisper.
It takes so little, right, to get the reaction going, and then it turns into cottage cheese. Yep. So what's happening here is, if you think about the average airbrush, you have a master seal that the needle, pokes through. Right. And what happens is when you're using that airbrush, thinner accumulates, thinner gloss paint, whatever you're shooting, it's going to accumulate on the back side of the master seal.
Yeah, creeps back in there.
That's a good word. It creeps back in on the back side of the seal. And so worst case scenario, you're shooting alclad. You clean the brush to the point where you look at it and you push the lever down. You get no thinner coming out. You add your Mission olive, green or whatever, and it turns into cottage cheese when you start shooting,
sparkly cottage cheese.
Sparkly cottage cheese. Yeah. So one of the things you can do there is, again, being sure to clean the brush as well as you can with the 3 for 5 between the acrylic and the lacquer. Try the lawn dart maneuver in order to make sure that there isn't any residual thinner or cleaner on the backside of the master seal that's going to foul the paint in the paint cup once you add it to the paint cup. So that's the lawn dart maneuver.
Other solution is not to paint for 24 hours between sessions so that a lot of that stuff will dry if any of it creeped back there.
Yeah, you can do that too. You can do that. But, this is the kind of stuff that
won't cause any other problems, though.
Like the needle seizing in the brush.
So that's exactly where I was going. How many times have you...
That's why I pull my needles.
Yep. Yep, that's what. How many times have you washed, cleaned your airbrush? You put it in the drawer. You go away for a month or two. You come back and you can't work the lever or pull the needle out of the
Yep.
airbrush.
It's locked up.
What's probably happened there is you had some gloss coat or some paint or whatever on the back side of the master seal. You put it into the drawer. It creeped down the needle into the nozzle. It dried. And now you're going to have to chip it out in order to pull your needle out. So putting the lawn dart maneuver there is one of the last things that you do when you're cleaning your brush. And not to beat a dead horse here, but if you do the 3 for 5, one of the last things I recommend is Tamiya Pink Top Cleaner, which is a lacquer. And even if I'm shooting acrylics, I will go, it's actually an acrylic lacquer, and I will put maybe a third of a cup, because that stuff's expensive. I'll use a third of a cup in my brush. I'll work the lever back aggressively. This being a lacquer, it tends to weep through all the threads and dislodge the water. I will let that sit for 5 minutes. I will blow that out, and then I'll do the lawn dart maneuver, and I'll blow it out a second time. And I always get a little of residual thinner pink top that worked its way on the back of the master seal. So working the lawn dart maneuver into both your cleaning protocol regularly when you're switching between strong colors, as well as making it kind of like the last thing you do after your pink top, but before you put it in the drawer, flick it down a couple of hard times and blow any of that residual thinner out before you put it away. It's time well spent. So enough of that one.
So just slinging it to the end of the brush.
Sling it to the end of the brush. Imagine in your mind that you're flicking stuff from the tail of the brush to the nose of the brush.
Yep.
But the most important thing about the lawn dart maneuver
is to not let go of the airbrush.
Well, I didn't want to. You got ahead of me there. Mike. I had this whole thing worked. This is so important. I wanted to say for our German listeners, am wichtigsten. It's very important. For our Italian listeners, più importante. That's how important it is. I've been practicing this stuff all week. That's how important it is. Don't let the brush go. And yes, I have had a customer send me an Infinity that was literally embedded in the floor in front of him because he tried to do the lawn dart maneuver while the hose was still connected. And he lost the brush, came out of his hand, and it implanted in the floor, and it was not pretty. So don't let it go, guys.
And if you're worried about that, put a pillow between your feet before you do it.
Hey, that's a good, I never thought of that. That's a really good idea. Or walk outside and do it on the grass,
There you go.
But anyway,
wrap the hose around your wrist.
Yeah, there you go.
So now moving on to Mark Doremus. I think we know that name. He has a Sotar 2020. He also has an Iwata Neo CNS. And he complains about leaky air valves, meaning when he assembles the brush after cleaning and he lets up, pushes down on the lever and then lets up on the lever, he still has air bleeding through the air valve.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think it's closing slow.
Yeah. It's closing slow or it's not closing at all. And
Right.
it's giving you a constant bleed through. I think we've all faced this, if you've been airbrushing for a couple of years, you're going to see that sooner or later. So one of the easy ways to fix that, first and foremost, for both of these brushes, both the Sotar and the Iwata, they have air valves that are basically spring actuated. They have very small springs inside the air valves. So one of the things you're going to want to do on any airbrush that has that kind of an air valve, when you're doing a complete tear down, clean on it, take the air valve apart. First and foremost, look for oxidation or any kind of patina onto the shaft of the air valve. And when I say shaft, you're going to take these things about, and it's basically a little, stem, if you will. It's very thin, oftentimes made out of brass with a small O-ring around it. That's the air valve stem. And that's actuated up and down by a spring. So the first thing you're going to want to do is break the air valve down so you can get to the stem. And if it has a patina or if it has a rough finish on it, it's been exposed to thinner or paint and it started corroding. Best thing to do is replace it. And you can get these parts from, practically any place. Spray Gunner is a good place. They have, a large selection of these parts. The other thing that you can do if you don't want to put money into a new part is if you grab your Micromash 12,000, the pads.
Yeah.
Those are really good for buffing out these small parts and getting rid of some of the surface oxidation so that they're smooth and that they travel the way they should. The other thing that you're going to want to do, and this is what I do anytime I rebuild either one of these airbrushes in the shop or any airbrush that has this air valve design, and I end up taking the air valve apart. Once I get down to that spring, if I verify that the spring has no oxidation or corrosion on it, I'll take that spring and I'll stretch it a little bit. And, you're not cheating.
Right.
With repeated use being compressed, that spring is going to lose, some of its spring, if you will. So I'll take the spring and lengthen it maybe by about a third or maybe a half of its length, hold it a little bit. And then when I reassemble the air valve, you'll find that you have much more tension on that air stem, and it pretty much cures the leak.
Yeah.
So that's an easy and quick.
Or you can just purchase a whole new valve stem and put it up there.
You can, and those valve stems are between $15 to $20.
Yeah, they're not really very expensive. I did that on a Badger once.
Yep. I do it on a Wattas. I do it on harder Steenbecks regularly. They're not that expensive, but some guys actually like taking it apart and working on it.
Yeah, that person is Mike.
So for those guys, micromesh the valve stem, 12,000, you don't want to do anything like sandpaper because you're going to scratch it at that point and it's not going to move smoothly, within the O-ring. And most of them have a small O-ring. So anyway, a little micromesh and, stretch the spring and you should be good. All right. And moving on. Okay. From Jason Lindsay. He wants some general suggestions for diluting acrylic and lacquer paints. And I'm going to take, once again, the opportunity for a shameless plug. If you go to Model Paint Solutions and go to the homepage, there is the top row of articles are the tips and tricks airbrushing articles. And if you look for Volume 3, which is essentially matching the tip size, dilution, and air pressure to the job. Within that article, I give suggestions on dilutions, whether you're using acrylics or lacquers or enamels. I give suggestions for paint dilutions for general work, and general defined by cockpits, wheel wells, that kind of stuff, versus fine line work, which is going to be 1 millimeter wide lines or thinner. Or shooting over pre-shading, which is going to be between 20 or 30% paint. So anyway, pretty much most of what I know about airbrushing is in that Volume 3 tips and tricks. So for a good starting point of what percent paint should I be using for this job, if you just check that article, I give a breakdown of that, and I give examples with pictures of models of different scales and the percent paints I use for the various aspects of those paint schemes.
Do you find that most modelers you talk to under-thin their paints?
Completely, totally.
Yep. That's my impression as well.
That is the leading problem or the leading cause of all the problems that are most commonly associated with newbie airbrush experiences. So clogging and intermittent spraying and, foul tips and rough powdery finishes, all of those things can be traced back to using paint that's too thick. A lot of guys, for whatever the reason, start using 50% paint, 50% thinner because it just sounds good, I guess.
Right.
And you can get that to work. I'm not saying that won't work.
Yeah, but enough pressure, you can move toothpaste through your airbrush.
It'll work, but sooner or later, if you stick with the sport, you're going to want your finishes to have less cottage cheese to them. You're going to want them to be finer and smoother. You're going to want to do fine line shooting, and not make it such a challenge, because of the air pressures are so high, because the paint is so thick. So once you want to up your game, a lot of guys find that they have to increase the dilution on their paint, and the paint behaves the way they want it to. So that's really what that article is all about, is addressing that issue of what percent paint do you use. And as a general, is just you guys say, what should I start at just for general work? 30 to 40% paint, the balance thinner. That's a good general place to start, whether it's a lacquer, whether it's an enamel, whether it's an acrylic, Mission, Vallejo, Life Color, Gunze, Mr. Color, you name it. Most of those paints, all, I would dare say, when diluted to about 30% paint, 70% thinner, they shoot very, very nicely. And that's pretty much what I shoot for most of my work. So I kind of save the hardest for last.
Okay. And I have a question, a late question that's come in from a listener that after your last question, let me know.
Okay. So this is from Lord Lloyd, and he is a contributor to Reddit 72nd Scale. And he asks about how to lessen dry, powdery finishes on wing roots in places where you have a 90-degree structure. Yes.
Yes, that's a great one.
Isn't it a great one?
Yeah.
And here's the deal. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but this is a nuanced answer.
Yes, it is, because it's a number of things.
It's a number of
just
things.
One.
It's a number of things. And, I love to go back. I'm going to get tangentized. I love to go back to the Facebook analogy where you've got Mario there in Seaside, Miami, and he goes on Facebook and he says what dilution pressure and, how he's diluting his paint. And it's not working, and he wants to know why. And Sven, Sven. Yeah. Who's,
the
up
guy
there.
Who's up in northern Sweden.
Right. Exactly. Who has an entirely different situation with regards to humidity, and partial pressure, elevation. And they get on Facebook and they start calling each other stupid because the paint doesn't work the way it should, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Without ever taking a step back and realizing that, what they're dealing with there is wildly different atmospheric conditions, which, if you're shooting acrylics in particular, have a huge effect on how the paint behaves. So with that as a preface, this is a nuanced answer. So I think especially the aircraft guys, I'm biased because that's what I am. When I was a wee baby modeler, one of the things that drove me nuts is if I was doing, let's say, a Spitfire, and you're looking at the vertical horizontal stabilizer, structure right there where you have that 90-degree angle.
Yeah.
By the time you shoot your primer and you shoot your paint, that 90-degree area has a powdery, rough finish.
Yep.
And it starts with the primer, and if you don't catch it with a primer, you just exacerbate it with the paint. So how do you fix that? How indeed. So let's take some broad strokes at first. So first and foremost, if you're shooting 50% paint, you're probably shooting paint that's too thick. The thicker the paint, the more likely you are to get that dry, powdery finish. So the first thing to think about is, what dilution paint am I using? If you're using 40% paint, try dropping that down to 30%. You're going to get less dry, pebbly overspray when you do that, just in general. Number one.
Yep.
Number two, if you're using a lacquer, slow the paint down a little bit. In other words, make it dry a little more slowly. And again, Mr. Color, Mr. Retarder, if you're running a lacquer-based thinner, is a really good reagent to use to slow the paint down. Let's say you're not using a lacquer. Let's say you're shooting Vallejo and you're shooting in an acrylic, alcohol water-based thinner. I'm a firm believer in Liquitex, Flow Aid, and Slow Dry. Now, that does not mean that similar products made by Vallejo and AK and other such companies won't work. They will. Most of these flow enhancers and drying retarders work basically the same way. So one of the things you can do is, if you're shooting an acrylic primer and paint, think about adding a flow retarder like Liquitex Flow and a paint retarder like Liquitex Slow Dry to about 10% by volume each. So hypothetically, you'd have 10% flow, 10% slow, in 80% thinner. acrylic thinner, and make that up in bulk ahead of time. And then when you do your dilution of paint, let's say it's acrylic and you do 30% paint, you will already have your slow, your slow dry and your flow enhancer in there. That will go a long way to decreasing the dry, crusty finish on those 90-degree structures. The other thing that you can do is, as many guys learn through trial and error, is you can knock a lot of that powdery stuff off the finish, especially the primer stage, prior to painting. Yep. And some of that powdery stuff will come off just with your finger. Shameless plug time. I have long used swabs, and these are polyester or microfiber swabs that I was introduced to in a laboratory setting. Those things work great for knocking some of that primer overspray, powdery overspray down prior to painting. And they're also of the appropriate size that you can get. One of the smaller of the two swabs that are on the site is about the size of your pinky nail. And that's really good for getting into the very wing roots on 72nd and 48 scale kits after you prime. So you can knock some of that stuff down with a swab or with a tissue or just rubbing with your fingers. So that's one more trick to getting it down. And here comes the nuance. Remember that when you're thinking about an airbrush that is spraying paint, you have a cone of paint or primer, right? The center of that cone is where the wettest paint is. The outside of that cone is where the dry stuff is. So one of the things you want to think about doing is, let's go back to our Spitfire with the vertical horizontal structure where you get most of the buildup. If you're shooting a lacquer that tends to level well on its own, think about shooting those structures with as much of a wet coat as you can and decrease the dry overspray just by shooting a semi-wet coat. If you're shooting an acrylic, which sometimes requires a nice preparatory dry coat prior to a wet fill coat, think about shooting a smaller pattern with your airbrush. So instead of pulling the lever back so that you're getting a thumbs wide pattern of paint, pull the lever back less so you're getting half a thumb's width of pattern. And shoot those areas where you have a 90-degree structure, shoot them with a smaller pattern, dry coat, and wet fill coat to decrease that dry overspray that you're going to get if you shoot it with more lever and more paint. Make sense?
Yep. Now, the one other thing that I've done is to help not necessarily minimize it, but it makes it easier to get rid of any that does develop, is to shoot the angles first. In other words, don't airbrush from the wingtip moving toward the wing root, but airbrush the wing root first and then move out toward the tip.
Yeah. And what we're talking now is angled shooting.
Yes.
And it's excellent that you brought that up. So again, if you think about that cone of paint coming out of your airbrush, again, the outside of that cone is going to be where most of the dry paint is. So if you can always be mindful and keep that cone directed away from that 90-degree angle, you'll get less dry overspray.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, this is a nuanced answer. There's lots of things that you can do here to correct this. The guys who are shooting, Gunze lacquers and leveling thinner, they're going, what dry overspray? Right?
Right.
Guys who are shooting, Vallejo and Mission going, yeah, man, that's all I get. Yeah. So it's wildly different. But again, if whether you're shooting a lacquer or an acrylic, slow the paint down with a retarder, add a flow agent that'll decrease dry overspray to begin with. And then while you're shooting those structures, be mindful of that dry overspray that occurs on the outside of the cone and use directed spraying, like you said, so that you get that away from that 90-degree angle as opposed to towards it.
Yeah.
Which is going to give you the overspray. So, yeah. Nuance. How about that?
Was that your last question?
That was my last question.
We have a late question from a listener named J. Clifford Bates Esquire, who wants to know why back flushing is the best way to mix your paint in the paint cup.
Thank you, Jim.
I think Jim's having a little fun with you.
Jim will pay for this. You can count on it. So back flushing. So I can tell you this. Model Paint Solutions has been running now for coming up on 7 years. And I've been repairing airbrushes for the entirety of that time. And whether it's an Iwata, Badger, or Harder Steenbeck, I can break the brush down. And 9 times out of 10, I can tell you whether this guy was back flushing the brush or not. And I can tell you that by how much paint has accumulated on the back side of the master seal. Now, a lot of guys aren't going to like that. There's lots of guys online showing how cool it is that you put your paint and your thinner in your paint cup, and you plug off the nose of the airbrush, and you push the lever down, and you bubble paint through your paint cup, and it mixes your paint. And isn't that cool? Sure, it's cool. But the problem is you're putting a fair amount of pressure on the master seal when you do that, and it's pushing paint and thinner on the back side of that seal. And this is what, sooner or later, you start getting a buildup of the paint, and that leads to a deterioration of the master seal. And the brush begins spitting and spattering when you're trying to shoot a straight line. That's because the master seal is leaking, because you have all this dried paint built up. So
don't do it.
Don't. Thank you, Jim. Like I said, and this is almost like a little a crusade of mine. When I get a brush in and I find that it has a horrendous amount of paint built up on the back of the master seal. When I send the owner an email and I say, okay, here's what I found, here's what I'm going to do to fix it, I always ask the question, do you back flush? And it's surprising how many times you can correlate a whole bunch of paint built up on the back of the master seal with the guy that comes back and says, yeah, I do all the time. Yeah. Okay. Again, just to reiterate, I suspend paint in my paint cup by using a small pipette. And I will pull the paint up and keep it inside the pipette, push it up and down a few times. That's a great way of suspending your paint without making a mess.
Well, Jim said if I asked you that question, steam would actually come out of your ears. I wish we were on video so that I could see that.
I'm just wondering how I'm going to get into a position to kick him in the ass the next time he comes into my shop.
Please feel free. I want photos.
Drop a hurricane kit on the floor and he bends over to pick it up, kick him.
There you go.
There you go. Oh, that's
a great solution.
It's got to be a Canadian hurricane kit.
Yeah, Canadian hurricane kit.
Yeah, I love that. All right.
Well, this was great.
Well,
we
thanks.
covered a lot of ground.
We did, and I'm sure we're going to ignite some trolls, but that's what we do here, right?
There you go. Okay.
I'll direct them right to Model Paint Solutions.
Oh, yes, please. Oh, yes, please. I deal with them so well. Well, guys, it was fun as usual. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for coming on. Thank you for imparting knowledge. Again, I say this all the time. Every time you come on, I learn something new.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that very much.
John, thanks for joining us again, and we'll get you back on, in another quarter here of the year, and we'll have to think up something else to talk about.
Well, we'll have to do with Stump the Chump Volume 3.
There you go.
I like the idea of soliciting questions from the listeners, because that way we can, in some ways target exactly, what these guys want to hear. So I'd like to suggest that we do this again and just, Stump the Chump Volume 3. So, as you know, guys, we took all the names, the guys that submitted questions, and we did a little raffle. And Lee Fogel is the gentleman that wins the Mix-a-Lot kit, actually. So, So, Lee, send me an email, send me your shipping address, and we'll get that out to you. And many thanks, sincerely, to all the guys who submitted questions. I greatly appreciate your input.
All right, John. Until next time, we'll catch you around. Well, Dave, did you learn anything?
I did. Every time we have Dr. Miller on, I learn something new, and this one was no exception. No matter how long you've been doing this, you there's always more to learn. That's one of the great things about modeling, is that no matter how long you do it, there's more stuff to learn. You discover new stuff, and that's part of what keeps it fresh. So I love it every time Miller comes on.
Well, I do too. He's a lot of fun to talk to, and hear some interesting things, learn some interesting things, give you some stuff to think about. You know, whether you agree with all of it or not, it's some stuff to try.
Yep.
See what works, see what doesn't. And I tell you, I look forward to having him again.
Me too. Me too.
Well, Dave, we got to close this one out because we're running out of June.
Yeah, that's right. We're running out of June. You're running out of time, and we gotta get on down the road.
So, as we always say,
so many kids,
so little time, Dave. Hopefully, I'll catch you on the floor.
You got it.